time, we're back in the studio and we have another studio guest with us. A very warm welcome to Justin Morris, who is Chief Executive of Bristol Zoo. And Justin, you're also a trustee of the Natural History Consortium, which puts together the Communicate conference.
I am indeed, and thanks, Savita. It's lovely to be here with you chatting, although it's virtual. But yeah, great to have the opportunity to sit down and talk to you.
Well, thank you for joining us. And it's a bit funny that we're meeting virtually, being so close together. And of course, Bristol Zoo has hosted Communicate for the last few years, and we're disappointed, but probably made the right decision not to come back. But can you tell us about some of the things that are happening at the zoo right now that you might have told delegates about as we came to visit this year?
Sure, and actually you might be surprised to hear me say that despite the pandemic, actually quite a lot has continued as normal. And even though visitors haven't had the same opportunity until relatively recently to see that for themselves. So for instance, our conservation breeding programs have continued. So we've had a number of notable births this year, in particular Western lowland gorilla, two-toed sloths, through to partula snails. And although our learning programs for school students are only really just beginning to be re-established, we've been able to continue working with our university partners, teaching more than 350 undergraduates and postgrads across our degree programs, which has been fantastic. And I should probably address the elephant in the room as well, which is that we've also taken a difficult decision during the course of the pandemic at the end of last year that we're planning to move Bristol Zoo to our sister site at Wild Place Project. And actually, we're excited about the opportunity that presents in terms of considering both the future of the Bristol Zoo Garden site, but really importantly, the kind of zoo that we want to create at the Wild Place Project site and how we're going to continue to fulfill our mission of saving wildlife together.
Fantastic. And we've obviously got people here from all over the country and even beyond. So if you haven't yet been to Bristol Zoo, if you haven't yet been to Bristol, I know there's lots of great information on the website about that. If you're thinking, now, how do you move a zoo? There's lots of great information about that project and how that's going to happen.
Yeah.
So we've had, a fantastic turnout at Communicate this year. And the theme, as you know, is on the road to COP15 and COP26. So I'm interested to hear, what role those kind of international events play for Bristol Zoo or zoos more widely?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I mean, actually, they are increasingly important to us. And I don't think there's any question that zoos actually have quite a significant role to play, both directly and indirectly, in addressing the climate and ecological emergencies. So I think zoos are particularly well placed to engage a really broad cross-section of society with the threats that wildlife in particular are facing, and of course inspiring the next generation of conservationists as a result. I think at Bristol Zoological Society specifically, because of our higher education programs in particular, we've got a real opportunity to train the future leaders in conservation. And that might be everything from kind of practical conservation methods through to the theory behind conservation decision making, and of course effective communication for conservation. And I think that's so important at this time when there's so much misinformation, especially around the climate crisis and COP26 in particular. But also for us, I think with regard to COP15, we've got an opportunity to really much more directly contribute to that. And that takes a number of different forms. So some of that might be about the species that we're breeding in our targeted conservation programs and creating genetically viable populations. And actually, there's a requirement in the COP15 framework about ex situ conservation. And that's something that's going to be debated in Kunming later this year. But we've also obviously got an opportunity to kind of mentor and support those working in situ, in country, through conservation, breeding and reintroduction centres. And of course, we're working with lots of partners around the world through our applied conservation programs where we're working with communities to protect habitats for species. So I think actually, there's lots of ways in which our types of organisation can increasingly make quite a direct difference, and that's really relevant to both of the COPs, I think.
I mean, one of the key things we've been talking about over the last 2 days, you won't be surprised to hear, is the impact after COVID as well, both related to COP and not. And we've been looking at post-environmental behaviours and a whole range. Now, last year at Communicate, we had a really popular session with Sharon Redrobe, who is from Twycross Zoo. I don't know if you know,
I know Sharon well. Yeah.
And it was kind of right in the heart of COVID, and she was able to tell us, you know, some really detailed information about how her zoo was being affected, and some of her views on how zoos in general were affected. And, you know, kind of a year later, are things looking a bit brighter now that, you know, visitors are returning?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously it's been a really challenging 18 months, but that, you know, that is the case for all organisations and actually for all of us as individuals. I think for zoos in particular, you know, we have quite rightly needed to maintain the same very high standard of animal care that you would expect us to, and there is a cost attached to that. And in the absence of visitors for many months last year and this year, you know, that has been really challenging in terms of the financial impact of that. But, you know, I do think our inherent strengths, which is that we are largely outdoor destinations and we're providing people with an opportunity to connect with nature in a really authentic and impactful way, giving them a respite from being in isolation, a respite from screens, and, you know, generally we're good for people's health and well-being. I think those inherent strengths are going to be really important for us as we emerge from the pandemic, and those are things which I think that we'll look to harness as we go forward. We've had a lot more visitors this summer than we were expecting, which has been fantastic, and that's given us an opportunity to reinstate some of our public engagement and learning activities and generate some revenue. So I'm actually really hopeful that zoos are going to go from strength to strength as we regroup over the next few years and actually really make the most of the opportunity for wildlife to be part of everyone's lives. I think we're starting now from a great position, I think.
I think it would be really interesting at a future conference to look back on some of these discussions. You know, the zoo is a founding partner of the Natural History Consortium, has been there from the beginning at Communicate, and I think it's meant that we've always had a really strong presence from zoos and visitor centres, which hold a really important piece of the conservation puzzle. So maybe one for us to talk about another time, about how we might next year, or even the year after, kind of do a bit of a retrospective on, you know, some of the changes we've seen. Now, over the last couple of days, I've had a whole range of studio guests, which has been fantastic. And I've been posing 2 questions to all of them. So they're over to you as well. So the first is, it'd be great to hear about an example of a project or a piece of practice, whether in zoos or outside of zoos, that has been inspiring you over the last few months.
Yeah, so I'm going to give you a zoo example, or at least a conservation charity which runs zoos, which is the Wildlife Conservation Society, which for those people that don't know, was the New York Zoological Society until the early 90s. And the thing that really continues to impress me about them is their digital engagement, and in particular their individual giving communication. So they're always kind of surprising me with new ways to tell their conservation story and how we can help them to make a difference for wildlife. And they're really good in particular at kind of match funding promises and using things like World Elephant Day or whatever World Animal Day it is. There seems to be an animal for every day of the year. And just creating a really strong sense of urgency in order to elicit an immediate reaction. And they're always using lots of different types of digital asset and evolving their messaging. So whenever something drops into my inbox from them, I'm always intrigued to see kind of what's coming next. So I'd encourage anyone to kind of have a look at what they do in terms of their digital communication, because actually I think it's really interesting.
That's great. We will put a link to their site, maybe their newsletter, in our chat. It's a good opportunity for me to remind everyone, if you've got a project or an inspiring example, we'd love you to put a link or any kind of resource that you want in the chat. We'll be mining that chat for the whole list of resources over the 2 days and sending that back as a really helpful PDF. Everything you found out at Communicate in one helpful place. And it's also a good opportunity for me to plug our digital fundraising session, which is at the end of today. We've got a digital fundraising expert who's giving up his time to come and do a short 45-minute masterclass. So if you're intrigued by that example, don't miss that session at the end of today. So Justin, my kind of final question to you that I've been asking all of my studio guests, we haven't got much left of Communicate today. We've got a couple of more sessions really inspiring coming up. And it's back to the day job tomorrow. So what's your provocation or challenge to Communicate while we're all here together?
Yeah, so really, really good question. And so my challenge would be open to thinking differently. Every organization is having to reconsider its priorities, how it can fulfill its purpose most effectively, and in particular in a much more constrained funding environment. And as a result, I think we all need to respond to that challenge with new thinking, new creativity and innovation, and people being open to that and recognizing that things are not the same. And I think, the pandemic has really demonstrated that we can work differently. So thinking about what we as individuals can do to learn from the experience of the last 18 months and being open to thinking differently about how we're going to create the greatest impact for people as we engage them. And don't be afraid to tell your boss what your great idea is, having been prepared to think differently about the future. That would be my advice and my challenge to everyone.
Great. Well, that's a fantastic challenge to finish our live session on. We've got a number of rounds of exciting sessions coming up.